During the last half of the 19th century, the West experienced the most dramatic changes in its history. Between 1850 and 1890, the American Indians, who had lived on the land for at least 13,000 years, were generally displaced by new peoples possessing different cultures and values. As you view the historic ground before you and the mountains and hills in the distance, we ask you to imagine, to let your mind roll back over 150 years. You are in that vast territory between the Black Hills and the Bighorns, the Yellowstone and the Platte, then known as Dakota Territory. There are no houses or towns, no fences or roads, except the Bozeman Trail. You've arrived by wagon, horse, or on foot, slow, uncomfortable, tedious. With no communications, you're cut off from civilization. If you're non-native, you live at best on beef, bacon, salt pork, bread, hardtack, canned fruit, and dried vegetables. At the worst, just on salt pork and hardtack. If you're native, the buffalo provides not only your main food source, but your shelter, clothing, weapons, and over 100 other needs. Perhaps you're an immigrant woman or the wife of an army officer enduring unexpected hardships and dangers, or a native woman suffering the adversity of her nation at war. You may be from a band of Lakota, Northern Cheyenne, or Arapaho, watching those who would intrude on your last great hunting grounds, threatening your traditional lifestyle, freedom, and very existence. Or you may be a friendly Crow, resigned to the coming of the white man and driven by the Lakota and Cheyenne from what had been considered for many years to be your land. Perhaps you are a cowboy with the 1866 Nelson Story cattle drive of Texas Longhorns, the first to come through, on its way to the goldfields of Montana, one of the last of the mountain men, or a miner camping nearby for protection. Or perhaps you're a soldier with Colonel Henry B. Carrington's 18th Infantry, assigned to build a fort along this northward trail to the Montana goldfields. Though the route has gone down in history as the Bozeman Trail, named for the man who first blazed it, John Bozeman, it overlaid a route the tribes had used for centuries. The trail went directly through the last and best of native hunting grounds. Whoever you are and wherever you come from, your lives during that short 2-year history when Fort Phil Kearny was built, abandoned, and burned to the ground will be caught up forever in the interlude between the Civil War and the Battle of the Little Bighorn a decade later. The land today looks much like it did when Colonel Carrington first saw it. A desk soldier during the Civil War, having never served on the field of battle, Colonel Carrington was nevertheless given an assignment in the very heart of Indian country. General Sherman apparently considered the area safe and approved and encouraged the inclusion of Mrs. Carrington and other women and children with the party. And so it was that Colonel Henry B. Carrington and his party left Fort Stephen Kearny, Nebraska on May 19, 1866, with orders to move and rebuild Fort Reno, formerly named Fort Connor, and construct 2 new forts along the Bozeman Trail. In that group traveling westward were more than 1,000 men. About 700 were soldiers, many raw recruits, and the rest civilian freighters. 226 mule-drawn wagons and a cattle herd of over 1,000 animals. Women and children rode in ambulances, followed by the cattle herd with mounted cavalry serving as rear guard. Accompanying the first contingent was famous mountain man Old Gabe Jim Bridger, then 62 years old, and as a chief interpreter for the Mountain District, one of the highest paid civilians in the West. Bridger's pay was $300 a month, almost double that of the officers and certainly much more than the soldiers, who drew $16 per month. Arriving at Fort Laramie, Carrington found peace negotiations underway. There are many stories about the events there, but it is unlikely that Carrington ever stood face to face with the man who would become his most bitter enemy, Red Cloud. Red Cloud and his group left in anger and vowed to fight the intruders of the Powder River country. From the native perspective, tribes and families were divided. Some Arapaho and Northern Cheyenne tribes, bitter from the brutal white attacks on mostly friendly settlements at the Connor Battle and at Sand Creek, Colorado, joined the Lakota of Red Cloud, young man afraid of his horses and high backbone, or hump, in opposition. Some Lakota bands, such as the Brule, were generally peaceful, and among them was conflict and differing opinions. The Crow were friendly to the newcomers and were traditional enemies of the Lakota and Cheyenne.
The Sand Creek Massacre had happened in Colorado. After that, the Cheyenne brought a war pipe to our people, the Lakota, and asked if we would join in kind of united warfare against people coming through and soldiers and whatnot. From that time on, they were very prepared to do something up here.
The Carrington Command moved on, leaving Fort Laramie on the 17th of June. And on Friday, the 13th of July, the command arrived at this location overlooking the area where Carrington decided to build Fort Phil Kearny, named for a distinguished Civil War general who died at the Battle of Chantilly. Though Fort Phil Kearny was in almost a continual state of construction, and though much was done after Carrington left, he was responsible for the design and most buildings at the fort. Carrington's men built over 60 structures of one kind or another: barracks, officers' quarters, a hospital, guardhouse, mule barns, a magazine, and numerous other buildings. Initially, they were temporary quarters made of tenting, then replaced with log and sod roofs, or board and batten covered with shingles. Soldiers built the huge upper stockade, 600 by 800 feet. Corners are now marked after present-day archaeology with reconstructed stockade walls. The magnificent flag was first raised on its towering 124-foot flagpole to the sound of the full band playing the Star-Spangled Banner on October 31st, 1866. Practically from the beginning, under constant siege from Red Cloud's warriors, those at the fort were barely able to protect themselves and their civilian contractors, let alone the immigrants along the trail. Later, the winter would become bitter, as though in response to the terrible battle to be fought there. But some never lost their sense of humor. Soldier Sam Gibson told of his stop at the settler's store to get tobacco during that winter.
A man's ear would get frostbitten just walking across the parade ground. I stomped my feet as I entered John Kinney's store and told him I wanted a handful of twists. I grouched about the 75-cent price. His reply was that tobacco was free. The 75 cents was for the stimulating climate.
In the morning of December 21st, pickets on Pilot Hill south of the fort signaled an attack on the last wood train of the winter traveling along Sullivan Hills, and Carrington again ordered Captain James Powell to relieve it. Captain Fetterman asked to go instead, basing his request on seniority. Carrington let him go after warning him to relieve the wood train and to not pursue Indians over Lodge Trail Ridge. Civilians Wheatley and Fisher went along to test their new Henry repeater rifles. Now the decoys, a group of about 10, with representatives from Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho tribes, took over. They goaded the troops, shouting insults and staying just out of firing range. It was a temptation which Fetterman seemingly did not resist, and he followed the decoy, crossing the ridge. When the trap was set, with no chance of the troops escaping, mounted warriors crossed paths down on the flats across Pinot Creek. This was the signal for large numbers of warriors to break out of ambush from the gullies to the north, east, and west of where the monument stands today.
But once this unfolded, what would quickly happen was close hand-to-hand combat. And pretty soon you're just right there, and it's face-to-face. A lot of that type of fighting.
The story of Adolph Metzger is one of the battle's most intriguing.
A bugler did fight heroically, and all he had was a bugle. And he fought with that, and so honorable that they did not mutilate his body, and they covered him with a buffalo rope, which is honorable.
Some native sources say that about a dozen of their men lost their lives on Fetterman Ridge, and many more were wounded. The mutilations at the Fetterman fight were among the worst on record. They were, however, rooted in the native tradition and religion, and were also performed in retribution for the horrors visited upon a peaceful tribe of Cheyenne and Arapaho, men, women, and children at the Sand Creek Massacre 2 years earlier. That grim night of December 21st, with bitter cold settling in, John Portuguese Phillips volunteered to ride for help. Though many accounts say that Phillips rode alone, Army records at both Fort Phil Kearny and Fort Reno, as well as witnesses at Fort Reno, record that a Daniel Dixon was also sent as a courier on the night of December 21st. They left the night of the battle under cover of dark through the fort gate near Little Piney. Sleeping and hiding during the day and riding at night, they made their way to Fort Reno. Several others joined them at Fort Reno, and they then rode on to Horseshoe Station, where Phillips sent Carrington's message of the Fetterman disaster to Omaha and to Fort Laramie.
It was a great victory for our people. A lot of the battles, including the Fetterman with the monuments, and they said that there were no survivors, but the native people survived and thrived and have for centuries. We have a lot of proud descendants today.
The Fetterman fight was one of a number of events which came together to damage Carrington's reputation, so that although he was cleared of responsibility at a hearing at Fort McPherson the next spring, his reputation suffered greatly. In the meantime, historians vary greatly on whether or not and to what degree blame should fall on Carrington, Fetterman, or perhaps Grummond. These are issues unlikely to be ever fully resolved. After the summer Sundance ceremonies, Lakota and Cheyenne determined to attack again near Fort Phil Kearny. On August 1st, a large number of the Lakota tribe moved from Goose Creek in the Sheridan area, preparing to attack the logging camp the next day. The location of the Wagon Box Fight of August 2, 1867 has been argued through the years, but archaeological findings point to it encompassing a large area, including where the monument sits today. Civilian contractors hauled logs from the pineries to the fort on wagon running gears, and in early July they built a corral of the wagon boxes to protect stock from being run off by the Indians. 14 boxes were placed end to end in an oval about 70 feet wide and 100 feet long, with space between wide enough for a man. Supplies were stored in 3 of the wagons, and soldiers and civilians slept in tents outside the enclosure. According to Captain James Powell's official report,
on the morning in question, I had 26 men, 4 citizens, and 1 officer at my disposal. About 9 o'clock, we were surrounded by 800 mounted Indians, but owing to the very effective fire of my small party, they were driven back with considerable loss. Finding that they could not enter the corral, they retired to a hill about 600 yards distant, and there, striped for more determined fighting. With additional reinforcements, they continued to charge us on foot for 3 consecutive hours. About 12:30 o'clock, they retired, leaving some of their dead and wounded near the corral. In my opinion, there were no less than 60 Indians killed on the spot, and 120 severely wounded. We had lost 3 men, including Lieutenant Jennis. Much of our success was due to our new breech loaders.
regardless of the Wagon Box Fight or its outcome, the days of the Bozeman Trail forts were clearly numbered. As the trail was closed to all civilian traffic after the Fetterman fight, with massive logistical problems of servicing an army so far from supply bases, it was estimated, according to Captain Alexander Wishart, to be costing the government about $1 million a week to fight the Indian Wars. But even more significant was the fact that the Transcontinental Railroad was nearing completion, soon to render the Bozeman Trail near obsolete. As Red Cloud's War continued, civilian traffic was reduced to a trickle in 1867, while most wagon trains on the trail carried supplies for the forts. In the meantime, Congress created a peace commission. The priority was to finish the Union Pacific Railroad, and the troops were needed first to do this. So by 1868, everything added up to the need for peace. A peace which Red Cloud would not agree to without the total abandonment of the 3 forts, the retreat of the soldiers, and the abandonment of the Bozeman Trail Powder River area back to Fort Laramie. The last contingent pulled out of Fort Phil Kearny during the final days of August. Red Cloud signed the peace treaty at Fort Laramie in November of 1868, only after Reno, Phil Kearny, and C.F. Smith were abandoned and the Bozeman Trail was closed. Fort Phil Kearny was later burned almost to the ground, probably by the Cheyenne under Little Wolf. The Lakota and Cheyenne and others had been aware for years, however, that with the steadily diminishing buffalo herds on which they depended, their nomadic life would at some point become unsustainable. The question for them was when. Most of the victorious Lakota and Cheyenne continued living nomadic lives for 8 more years until pressure from white settlers, advancing railroad construction, and gold strikes in the Black Hills brought on a new war in 1876. Even after the tribe's historic win at the Battle of the Little Bighorn, within 1 year, the tribes came into the reservations, ending forever their supremacy on the northern plains.
So to Wakan Tonka, the Great Spirit, Pilamia Wopila, thank you, Mitakwe Oyasin, we're all related. Thank you.
Thank you.